Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Shaping Tomorrow on IKIM FM. I'm Shafiq Burhanuddin, a fellow at IKIM, a think tank based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And in this episode, alhamdulillah, we are so grateful to have with us a guest, a young scholar all the way from Italy. Her name is Dr. Francesca. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Francesca.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Alhamdulillah, it's our pleasure. Before we proceed, please allow me to read your profile. Francesca holds a PhD in systemic neurosciences from the University of Munich, Germany. She has been working in the field of Islamic studies and mental health for the last 15 years, contributing to the revival of traditional Islamic psychology. She holds a teaching circle of Islamic spirituality for women in Italy, as well as several academic positions. She has authored essays, manifesto, and poetry collections. I think if we were to look up in terms of your work, Dr. Francesca, your interest is quite wide-ranging, but I believe you have something very interesting to share with us in terms of your perspective, in terms of how we are framing the challenge of psychology that we're seeing, whether it be in Muslim communities or the world at large. So without further ado, please, the floor is yours, Dr. Francesca.
Thank you so much, Doctor, and thanks for having invited me here and to have allowed me to do a little bit of a deep dive on the topic of mental health in Malaysia, because I have had to read a little bit to prepare for today, and I discover many interesting things. So my purpose here is just to bring some ideas on things that maybe you already know, but they come from a slightly different perspective, that is the wider Islamic psychology movement, and I'll try to explain a bit more in depth what that is and why that is important all over the world. So my aim is basically to show how mental health should not be treated as an individual matter, as a private matter at all, and individualism and its related capitalistic originating ideologies have actually ruined people's mental health further rather than improving it. So we will start according to a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ala kullukum ra'yan wa kullukum mas'u'un an ra'yatihi." Every one of you is a shepherd and is responsible, will be asked literally about his flock. Then an example immediately comes up. The leader of people is a guardian and is responsible for its subjects. And then the hadith includes more examples about people who are shepherds of other people and are therefore responsible for them. This, of course, ties to the state's responsibility of mental health. And that's why I chose that hadith. And I chose a hadith that talks about it on an educational, even affective way. A good shepherd loves the flock, right? And my claim will be that most states have tried to care, of course, about their citizens' mental health. Everyone does, and Malaysia is doing a lot of efforts in this regard, exactly as we speak, in this very year. But there might be some mistakes behind, and there might be some things we have not thought about yet. Main mistake I'm going to talk about is to consider mental health issues as a case of economic loss. This is because, in line with the Malaysian tradition, I will instead frame it as a moral loss, or a loss of adab, to use Dr. Al-Atta's words. And we will then see how the wider field of Islamic psychology let us look at the whole process, problem, understanding, and solution under a new light and a coherent one. So first of all, we should look at the data. And what I've looked at, there are some reports from the government of Malaysia. There's the British Journal of Psychiatry that dedicated quite a few articles to the situation in Malaysia, and the World Health Organization. And what they all agree that in Malaysia, in the last few years, there have been rising cases of depression, anxiety, other psychological conditions. And this has been dubbed by the British Journal of Psychiatry as a silent crisis, which should no longer be ignored. And I agree with that. The statistics show 29% of Malaysian adults experience mental health issues, and this rate has tripled since 1996. Among adolescents, 1 in 4 is battling depression, and 1 in 10 has attempted suicide, according to a 2022 health and morbidity survey from Malaysia. Now, This data is dramatic. It is as dramatic as other places, though. This is a worldwide trend, not to say that Malaysia is particularly struggling on it. It is struggling. Everyone is struggling mental health-wise at the present moment. And most publications that discuss this agree, saying things, and here I read from the British Journal, Malaysia stands at the precipice. The current trajectory suggests that private suffering, the silent anxiety, depression, and spiritual dislocation of the individual is metastasizing into public instability, threatening workforce productivity and social cohesion. So the way this is framed is that, oh, we should really take care of the mental health of people, or our economy will be at loss, or very tangible consequences will happen. But what I see is that the threat for Malaysia should be understood as a threat to the ethos of the nation. And this point is the most important, because as human beings, it is meaning that moves us, not productivity, not metrics, not economic growth. So I am not trying to use Malaysian ideas here to make Malaysians happy. I would really like to stress this, because this is actually this key point, that is the ethos of a people, which is the most valuable asset that one has. It's also very well known in the German tradition. I've done my university and doctoral studies in Germany. I'm very familiar with German thought. So the Volksgeist, the spirit of a people, is a very key factor in classical German thought. And it highlights this idea: every community has a spirit, and this spirit needs preservation. Otherwise, any talk of identity becomes empty, rabid, desperate. And this, if you look at it, is exactly what is happening in Europe. We lost our identity, and now we are so desperate to get it back that we give our votes to fascists, extremists, Islamophobes, xenophobes, under the dream of Europe for Europeans. So this is just a case study to show, if we lose our spirit, very dark consequences might come our way. So let's not repeat the same mistake. And I believe that Malaysia is not lost yet as much as Europe is in terms of these aspects. So please remember our words and learn from our errors and experiences. The danger is very real. The consequences are very horrible. So let's get back to Malaysia and to the data. Right now, untreated mental illness is estimated contributes to 37% of the country's disability burden, and costs a lot in productivity, of course, we said. But what is more important is the concept that disability, which is usually something that we understand in traditional society as a physical loss, not being able to work because of old age, loss of a limb, blindness, now more than a third of this is actually in the mind. And loss of productivity, we don't care about the money. What we care, loss of lives and achievements and goals that these people can make for their own self. A person who has a mental health related disability oftentimes cannot care very well for their children, is not able to be present for the community, is not able to have side projects, to take care of their garden, to do the things that make this dunya and this life beautiful and adorn it, to use a Quranic metaphor. Also, there are about 5 lives lost per day in 2019 to suicide, and this, of course, undermines the social fabric. So it is clear that investing in mental health is an investment not only in the nation economy, but in preserving this identity, in getting back these people to do meaningful things, to do things that can revive the Malaysian identity, what it means to be a person from Malaysia. But the values on which Malaysia is built are, I believe, a protection against this, but should be fine-honed for it to really work. So of those values, we can find the beginning of a solution. We have many nations that have a very hard time with the crisis of meaning, right? They don't know what it means. In Italy, we don't know what it means to be an Italian, to be honest, anymore. Maybe it means to eat pizza and spaghetti and to be a football fan, but there's nothing left beyond that. Community doesn't mean anything anymore. Lifestyle doesn't mean anything anymore. While in Malaysia, the intellectual and spiritual heritage, you still know what it is. It is the time to revive it. So if we integrate this framework, which highlights the beauty of culture, which is something crucial in Islam, not to erase culture, but to improve it and to show really, to make it shine the most beautiful things of a culture. If we integrate it in ilm al-nafs or Islamic psychology, this is really the perfect combination. Going back to Malaysian, in particular Malaysian Islam, we have the Shafi'i tradition, which incidentally, this is also my madhab, so I know a little bit more about this, which traces basically this golden chain from Imam al-Ghazali to the Malay luminaries. I've read a little bit about people such as Nuruddin al-Raniri, Abdul Samad al-Palimbani, people that are really important and have said things that are very important for mental health. And I'll try to highlight how. And then we arrive, of course, to the intellectual contemporary giant, Muhammad Naqib al-Attas. Through this, highlighting this, the government can really construct a mental health infrastructure which is culturally coherent and spiritually resilient. I say culturally coherent because one might think it's given for granted. But when we are importing British psychiatry as is, that's not really culturally coherent. There is no reason to think that Western disciplines are universal. They are Western, right, in nature. And in psychology and in mental health, this is something very discussed in post-colonial and decolonial studies. The samples for depression are white. The people are mainly white. They're from a certain culture. The psychiatrists are white. The people that write the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Psychiatry, they are white people from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. For us being Mediterranean already, we don't agree. Let's imagine Malaysia, how far away is that? So the first temptation, I understand, one is going through a mental health crisis. First thing they do, let's just copy what works. Let's copy. However, the results from Western culture have not worked. Yeah, so let's keep that in mind, because I talked about how it has not been great politically, but let's focus on mental health. From the loneliness epidemics, in particular in places like the UK and the Anglo-Saxon areas on the Northern Europe area, to the continuous rise of special needs children in schools, the West is completely engulfed with mental health issues. Everyone is in therapy. Therapy is not effective. Psychotropic medications have terrible side effects, are not very effective, and are overprescribed. So in the West, mental health has not been solved. It has become chronic. No hope for cure, no hope for healing. You stay in therapy forever. And as Muslims, furthermore, we should not ignore that in the 14 centuries of Islamic history, which we can use as case studies, we have developed very sophisticated ways to take care of the society's mental health. So, ilm al-nafs, literally the science of the psyche, the science of the self, or Islamic psychology, we call it nowadays, gives us a very holistic, complete understanding of human nature, putting together the mind, the body, the spirit. And health is seen here in this framework as an equilibrium between these facets. The physical agrees with the emotional, which agrees with the mental, which agrees with the spiritual. And illness is a disturbance of the equilibrium. So many centuries, or basically a millennia before holistic health became a thing, Muslim scholars were talking about this very same point. Let's make some cases for this. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, right? The greatest scholar of the Shafi'i tradition, very popular in Malaysia too, delved deeply in the understanding of the self and the sicknesses. And he said, inside us, there are multiple dimensions. There is a heart, which is the deep understanding. There is a spirit, which is the connection with the transcendent. There is the self, which wants and requires and is motivated. There is the intellect, the aql, which logically puts together things. And he explained in a way which is so deep, we still use it today in Islamic psychology. And it says that the self is always in an internal struggle. We have a base level in which these nafs asks us to do things that are harmful to us or to others. And then we have a reproachful self, which criticizes ourselves. And if you get stuck in this, you get a lot of guilt, and it's very hard to get out. And so we have our own psychology, and it's very refined because it defines health not only as not having symptoms, which is very low, but in being in perfect equilibrium, in having a meaning, in having purpose, in the fact that everything inside us agrees. In fact, the first healthy level of the nafs in classic Islamic tradition is al-nafs al-mutma'inna, which means the pacified, the soul at peace. The rest, imagine that as healing in psychology. Nowadays, we're talking a person is healed. If they have depression, they pop 5 pills and they can barely get out of bed. We're like, okay, case is solved, right? So we're talking about something much more ambitious than that. And Al-Ghazali said that the inner spiritual development, so prayer, meditation, dhikr, moral refinement, is as important as intellectual knowledge for mental health. He says that sometimes your moral life, your spiritual life are misaligned, and that's why you suffer. Also, his life shows this amazingly, right? But I don't want to go this tangent. It's also a thing I really love, classical Islamic studies, but let's not take the tangent. But the point to which I want to get is that the Islamic civilization took this psychological insight and made it into practical healthcare. In the classical period of Islam, starting from the year 1000, but even a few decades before that, we had some of the world's first hospitals with wards for mental illness. And how, please remember that until the 18th century in Europe, people who were struggling with mental health were locked up in chains, basically. Yeah, that's all was ever done to them. While 800, 900 years before, in the Muslim world, and some of these institutions, the Darus Shifa, the Bimaristan, as they're called, clearly show this. They're beautiful places. And people there received compassionate care, counseling, very creative therapies, such as color therapy. Color therapy was pioneered by the Ottoman world. Music therapy, already present in the Abbasid world. Advanced nutrition, sound therapy, hydrotherapy. So, for example, we have still archaeological examples. If you go in the Sultan Bayezid II hospital in Turkey, you see where music therapy was taken care of. You look at classical Muslim physicians like Al-Farabi, you see him writing on the therapeutic effects of music on the psyche. And in this Bimaristan, in these hospitals, people were taken away from their difficult circumstances for a while and given everything they needed until their condition stabilized, even aromatherapy, whatever, really. And this is a very stark contrast to what you see in a psych ward today in the West, but I'm sure even in Malaysia, because from what I understand, basically that's the same model which is being applied. It is a horrible place. It looks like a place where you go to die, to be honest. Hospitals, they're really horrendous in general in the world, yeah? And it's all white, no color, nothing has a meaning. The food is bland, the habits, there's not even fresh air, right? A lot of times there's air conditioning. So how can the psyche, which is integrated with the spirit, which is integrated with the body, heal? So some key ideas of the Islamic system of mental health care in these hospitals, which are revolutionary still today, are these: that mental health support is temporary and healing. We're not just putting a patch on it, we're fixing the person. And there were strict guidelines to when could you get a person out of the Bimaristan. And it was even measured in their appetite, when they could eat a full chicken with appetite, right? So imagine the level of care, right? Second point, a lot of resources have to be poured for a short period of time rather than a lifelong but very weak support. So you don't go to see the therapist once a week for 20 years. You stay 1 month in a place that rebuilds you from the ground up. Third idea, you don't heal your mind seeing someone for 20 minutes. It's deeper, it's longer. Embrace the fact that it takes time for people to talk about their problems. Body, mind, intellect, spirit, fully integrated. And final point, no spiritual bypassing. I'm saying this is super important. Sometimes in Muslim communities, this idea comes up. You have depression, pray it away. Yeah. Although there is a connection between the spirit and any sickness, we should treat this a bit more as a bodily sickness. So, of course, you break your leg. You're also, of course, going to recite Quran and ask Allah to heal you. And you're also going to do other things according to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, who said that there is a cure for every disease. And he ordered us seek the cure unless it's in the haram. Yeah. So the Malay scholars of the past have studied extensively Ghazali. So this thing was really very, very well known. And to this day, there are many Malay cultural concepts of personhood and illness that reflect an integrated understanding. And I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the Malaysian, but I've read a term which is sakit jiwa, that seems to be very interesting, which is a sickness of the soul, which describes mental distress. And here is the intuition is perfectly right, because a mental illness is between emotion, spiritual, psychological, physical. So you even have the linguistic infrastructure to do this well, mashallah. It's going to be really, really, really possible. Also, another concept that I've seen in some articles discussing mental health in Malaysia is this idea of seimbang or balance, and harmony, which is really deep, is really the point that Ghazali was trying to make. So in the Medicine of the Heart of Ghazali, he basically highlights how you do not just suppress a part of yourself, but you govern it, you make it rise. And this also resonates with another Malay concept, which is the buddhi, or putting together intellect and character. So as you see, we're talking public stability, but this is not like a thing the government does. This is a thing that the language does, the people do. It's really a community effort. And as much of modern logic in Europe discussed, language is really the ground upon which thought is built. So limits of the language means limits of the world, as Wittgenstein observed. And we could echo that then a better suited language opens an easier path to thinking. So it's going to be very important to elaborate Malaysian native ways to think about these problems in a language that facilitates. Yeah. There are also other frameworks that help with understanding mental health quite well. So for example, the metaphysics that arrived to Malaysia through Sufism, integrating Sharia, Haqiqa, provides this intellectual and rationalistic religious spirit that sees things such as, for example, a mental health problem as a bala, as a test, or as an imbalance, not as something which is just done as a punishment, as it tends to be sometimes seen as a simplification, even in the West nowadays. So if we introduce mental health intervention in Malaysia, which use this language, which use this background, it's going to be much more effective than just importing something from the West, or rather than reinventing the wheel. Many times in mental health care, Muslims are doing this mistake. They don't know about this whole theology tradition because, of course, nobody can know everything, right? So you specialize in psychology, you do not specialize in theology. You don't know that Ghazali already did this. So you do cognitive behavioral therapy and then you try to integrate it with the stories from the Quran. That's very common, which is good, yeah, better than nothing. But if you imagine that there is something already built there for you by massive geniuses, this is going to be much faster. And someone has to rediscover, repopularize it, reapply it. In the 17th century, there was this figure, Nuruddin al-Raniri, in the Malay area, who was called Sheikh al-Islam there. So I believe that's really shows the importance of him. who wrote an interesting book. I've read some extracts online, the Bustan al-Salatin, the Garden of Kings, which was a guide for a specific sultan. And this is usually studied as a historical text or as an adab text. But this is also very, very, very related to mental health, because he says that the mind of the sultan should be anchored in the remembrance of the akhirah and the fact that the world just passes. And this is really what this is a cognitive shield against the anxiety of ruling, against the corruption of power. So this shows how public stability starts with taking care of the mental health of the rulers, which I think is a genius move of psychology, of theological psychology, but anyway, still the same. Also, the way Imam al-Ghazali was popularized in the Malaysian environment by figures such as Sheikh Abdul Samad al-Palimbani, translating it, but not only translating it, adapting it to the Malaysian culture. That is so deep, because what he made, he took Bidayat al-Hidayah and he translated and adapted, making it more self-help manual, let's say, for the Malay world. And I mean, that's also part of mental health, really, care. And his contribution was basically that he operationalized the spiritual therapies as specific remedies for the diseases of the heart. So spinal everything is already there, right? It just needs to be adapted. It just made to make a link between what you see nowadays and how it was described at that time, but it's the same reality, because the psyche, the human heart, does not change that much. And many of the things that Al-Palimbani does in his book seems to be very much coherent with cognitive behavioral therapy. So you reflect about things in a different way. You start acting a different way, and that changes your beliefs. This is very well known in psychotherapy. However, from what I understand, is that in parallel with this tradition, a scholarly tradition, also there has been a more popular folk understanding of mental illnesses as coming from supernatural causes, from spiritual afflictions. And I don't want to disregard any part of the culture, but it is important to distinguish that some of these ideas were influenced by still pre-Islamic beliefs, and mixed with spiritual idioms make it seem that this is natively Islamic, but the bottom idea of mental health is really not. So all this importance which is given to curses, to spirits, and so on, doesn't seem to come very much from the spiritual theological tradition at all. And this duality is something that should be solved, I believe, and is really a point. Because if a person reads in the theological text a vision of mental health, but then in the environment or in their own cultural tradition, they're framed in a different way, this is going to create a cognitive dissonance and it's not really gonna work. So to provide really solid theologically backed understanding, which are understandable by the population, is going to be fundamental. And also to not embrace this idea, there's the body, there's the mind. This is very Western, as also very obsolete, as now classic books such as Descartes' Error by American psychiatrist Antonio Damasio showed quite openly. There is no mind here and body there. There's not such a thing. It's much more complicated than that. That's why we have so many words in Ilm al-Nafs to talk about the components of the self. And this underscores the idea that if we do a modern mental health initiative, we have to engage with the religious framework of the community instead of dismissing it, instead of importing. So religious institutions will have to be partner. And, you know, all we're doing here in improving mental health of the people, this is fully compatible with our values, our shared history, something that, you know, as wide as from Italy to Malaysia. It's the same story. It's the same story. Now, a few things changed from what I understand in Malaysia after COVID, and the mental health situation changed a little bit. And there are some surveys from the National Health and Morbidity surveys that show that in particular the youth is very much at risk. The children highlighted, for example, socioeconomic factors, that low-income households have much more mental health issues. But the one thing that improved after COVID has the awareness for people that mental health is important. So let's ride this wave, because it is it is important. So now that people achieved this awareness and maybe their own mental health is not that great and they feel it, let's give them the solution. And sometimes I see that public policy also aims for happiness as a metric, but it's good, of course, it's important. But this metric ends up being defined in Western secular terms as just maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. This is just hedonism. It is a Western idea. Yeah, it's not written in stone that is what happiness is. If we go back to the works of Sayyid Al-Attas, he talks about sa'ada, happiness, a lot. And he says that it is very different. He makes the contrast, the fact that happiness, the word happiness in English, is derived from the word hap, chance, fortune, right? So it's fleeting, it's emotional, it's dependent on external circumstances, whatever. You have a higher income, you're happy. I hope not, right? I hope that's not all there is. Well, he says that Islamic sa'ada is a permanent state of tranquility. Remember, I said that the first healthy state in Islamic psychology is nafs al-mutma'inna, the tranquil soul. So we're talking about the same variable. But if we measure it wrong, we're not going to be successful. Because measurement, therapy, awareness, they all have to follow the same metaphysical foundation. You can't have a disordered thought and expect outcomes. Philosophers are gonna be needed. Theologians are gonna be needed before we put psychotherapists and psychiatrists. So still, Al-Attas says that the population has the spiritual capital, right? This is an intangible asset that there is there. And we have seen that the state has tried their best to improve the situation. So there is the National Strategic Plan for Mental Health 2020-2025, which aimed to do a lot of things. And the plan, the specific target was reducing adolescent depression from 18 to 10% by 2025. I don't know if the results are out. I couldn't find them, but I hope they succeeded. But I want to just highlight a point about this. Western psychiatry does not have any preventive tool. So it can, at best, dull the hit of depression when it strikes, but it's not equipped with any tools for meaning, for prevention, for holistic, for community, for value-driven prevention. And value-driven is fundamental with depression in particular. We also have some goals around which mental health can be framed, and it is the Madani framework of Malaysia, which finds goals around sustainability, prosperity, innovation, respect, trust, compassion. These are also very relevant because in classical Islamic psychology, it is through values that we grow. Again, in Ihya Ulumuddin of Al-Ghazali, Munjiyat and Muhlikat as the two forces, the negative force of vices, the positive force of virtues that bring up and down the dynamic self of the human being. So now there's a lot of complexity on the table. So what can we do? A lot of effort will have to go into training counselors, because as you see, what I'm talking about is very different from what the average psychotherapist is familiar with. But these are very simple principles. In 35 minutes, we could go through them. So this is not something beyond human understanding. But when it is understood, it becomes a new framework able to guide the therapeutic work every day. Because again, therapy has to have a goal. There is no neutral therapy. Otherwise, it's very bad therapy, right? It's the one where you go and just vent to the therapist and he say, oh yeah, poor you. That's not therapy. It's just a venting spot. Therapy always have a goal. So let's not have this goal being materialistic, being reductionist, or being ineffective. Let's train psychotherapists, counselors imams, spiritual guides, the people to which people go when they are in trouble to give them what they need. So there are a lot of examples in this that we can get an inspiration from. For example, another figure I'd really like just to mention briefly is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi from the 9th century of the current era. Not of the Shafi'i fiqh, but with the broader Islamic tradition. He wrote one of the first manuals for treating mental illnesses, Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus, sustenance for the body and soul. And he talks about depression, he talks about anxiety, and he advises things such as behavioral activation. First you do, then you feel, frameworks that make a lot of sense in the therapeutic environment. This is to show that Islamic psychology does not mean to pray the depression away, like some people have this idea, like in some extremist groups, right, in the United States, where people like use even violent prayer. It's not what we're about at all, right? We were, in the Islamic tradition, the pioneers of things which are now called cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. All these things are already present in early Islamic treatises. So why to reinvent the wheel and take them from a source which is not theologically compatible with us? Let's also get back to the Shafi'i tradition as fiqh. Fiqh not only meaning halal and haram, but understanding, as it means in Arabic, and as so much related to mental health. You know, imams of the Shafi'i madhab promoted moderation in eating, sleeping, community involvement, which are all protective factors, as we call them nowadays, for mental health. The Shafi'i tradition, we also have the concept of maslaha, or public interest, in juristic decisions, which, you know, is about, it's important for supporting policies and spending money about mental health and mental well-being. The Islamic fiqh, the maqasid of preserving the intellect, hifz al-aql, as one of the objectives of the Sharia, really gives a very strong argument that caring for mental health is not just about the small discipline of ilm al-nafs. No, it's in fiqh. It's the objectives of the Sharia. So we're really talking about a huge infrastructure in Islamic thought that directly relates to the challenges that Malaysia is going through. Sayyid Al-Attas wrote about this a lot. One of the most beautiful, he wrote so many beautiful books. I've been reading him since, I don't know, 15 years, 10 years. Amazing. In The Nature of Man and the Psychology of the Human Soul in the 1990s, there is an Islamic psychology framework in it, which might be even more natively adapted to the Malaysian environment. And he says that the human being has a lot of faculties. They're active, cognitive, imaginative, and they all interact with the spiritual realm. And the aql, this rationality, is a light infused by God. He also has a beautiful, beautiful way to explain these components and to give values to them. And of course, metaphysics always should go hand in hand with empirical research. A psychology without the theory is lost. And nowadays, what we do a lot is just, you know, let's try to give people this therapy and see if it works. If it works, we do it. If it doesn't work, we don't do it. But it's purposeless. This is really a crazy approach. But if you will see, many methods that we apply nowadays in our hospitals are random. There's no theory behind. They just work. Maybe they don't even work there. They just work somewhere once, right? So another big aspect is going to be to build resilience and good character. And here is the whole tradition, even in Malaysia, very, very developed, of akhlaq, right? Manners that are translated in everyday actions. This infuses purposes. And also, let's remember that every one of us is a shepherd and we're responsible for our own flock. So improving mental health is going to be dependent also on involving communities, families, schools, everything, every group that there is there. So ultimately, let's say that from the classical Islamic wisdom from Al-Ghazali, we see that healing must address both the outer behavior and the inner soul. And if I were to boil down the ihya that I have here, right, just next to me, in a sentence, is that true healing is in a life of purpose, balance, and faith. And by embracing the Malaysian heritage of Ilm al-Nafs, both the intellectual rigor of Al-Attas, the spiritual depth of Al-Ghazali, the therapeutic governance of Al-Raniri, Malaysia can really construct a mental health infrastructure that is not a borrowed import. Who knows if it's gonna work, but it's a homegrown, strong fortress, which you know it's gonna work. That's your culture, that's your identity, that's what you're about. This is the true essence of what the Malaysian Madani model should be for mental health. It's a nation, modern in the infrastructure, but it's timeless in the value. And the stability of the state is just a reflection of the tranquility of the citizens' souls. So to conclude, I have high hopes in you because of this tradition, which is flourishing, and this immense wealth that you have in terms of mental health. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk and research and know more about this topic. Barakallahu fiqh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francesca, for delivering us such a rigorous and culturally coherent, relatable to I think many of us who have been learning about our intellectual tradition in this part of the world. And I think there's a great deal of novelty in terms of how you're making the case to not individualize psychological challenges that we are seeing today. And it's I think it's relevant not only to Malaysia but many countries in the Muslim world, because I think we are suffering, or we are not being able to frame the problem, I think, more correctly in accordance to our lens as per how we look at the reality of the individual selves as well as the larger collective of the community. I'm wondering, Dr. Francesca, like if you mentioned some examples, concrete examples, how Muslim societies have lived and practiced to ensure that mental health is in balance, is preserved. You like you mentioned like the Bimaristan and the Darus Shifa in the Ottoman period. But I'm wondering whether also whether this idea of ilmun nafs, this knowledge about the reality of the soul, was in the past Muslim society, it was so embedded in them, such that when they construct their cities, when they build architectures in general, not only their hospitals but in general, all of it was promoting psychological well-being. So I think I think this direction of thinking is very important, because I think what you're trying to argue also is not to narrow the problem to merely an economic productive problem, to a capital that is often framed by the capitalist lens. But I think this should be our agenda, which has been our agenda for centuries in the Muslim world. So, Dr. Francesca, you have any thoughts on that in terms of moving forward? You know, as Muslim nations, we have been a civilization. Therefore, we should proceed as a civilization with all that resources that you have mentioned, the intellectual resources as well as the institutional resources.
Thanks. This is really the point. The fact that mental health care is so wide means that we have to take care of everything. You mentioned architecture. That's a fantastic example. There is the book Spiritual Significance of Islamic Architecture that came out a couple of years ago by Dr. Mustafa Badawi. Paints a very strong case for the mental, spiritual, psychological effects of architecture. But we could go wider than this and talk about food. Agricultural methods are not isolated. For example, there are certain substances that we take from our food that then we use to make neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters are then used to think. So are we taking care, for example, of pesticides? Are we taking care, for example, that the meat is of a sufficient quality, the eggs are of sufficient quality for these neurotransmitters to be synthesized? The way I see mental health is really everything. And I understand that the state cannot do everything. But the way we see the state and the way we see the duties of the state nowadays is different than we used to see it back then. Until colonization and the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate, all these things I've been talking about, the Darus Shifa, the Bimaristan, and many other things relating to mental health, were not state-sponsored. They were awqaf. And the Waqf institution is fundamental, because if we're going to have to pour this phenomenal amount of money on mental health of people, which I claim we should not at the same time taxate people to an extent to which then their mental health is affected by the taxes. I know I'm being extreme, but that's a very big problem for the idea of state. So the way that earlier generation have tried to solve this is to encourage charity at a private level, encourage the wealthy to build their own awqaf, and sensitize their understanding that mental health is one of the main ones towards which to pay the awqaf. This is the only way to go. There is no other way. It's going to be an education at the society at all levels, at the low levels, for them to be able to access the mental health services, at the high level, for them to be able to provide them. And the state, of course, has the role of a facilitator, because, of course, should put in place legislations that allow a waqf to be tax exempt, to have all the facilitations that they need to operate. Because we know very well how, for example, in the West, they strangle the awqaf under strange rules and norms and ways in which they control their administration and so on and so forth. That's another chapter. And we know very well how they abolished awqaf in the Muslim lands to destroy our intellectual tradition. So I would like to point to that. And of course, in the meanwhile, that is still not built, the level at which the state has to work is education. Education towards a foundation of the awqaf, but also education in individual and community-based resilience tools. And resilience is very important, because tests, even mental health tests, can come to anybody. You know, we have so many figures of our own tradition, shuyukh, and maybe another day we can talk about it, that struggle with their mental health, that had a depressive attack, they had a psychotic breakdown, and they're big shuyukh. Well, we think, you know, if you get one of these, you're done, it's finished. This does not bring resilience to people. But if we educate them, it's normal to struggle. It's normal to catch a fever, to break a bone. So it's also normal to have a problem with mental health. Then you get out of it. Imagine how better the person would feel. So these strategies are free, right? They don't cost any money. It's just a way to talk about it. But then cultivate the ground for big awqaf. And there are, mashallah, in Malaysia, many rich, committed Muslims. You're not in the situation of some other Muslim countries in which the elite is Islamophobic and the population is Muslim. MashaAllah, make use of this capital. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I think Dr. Francesca we require a multi-pronged approach. You know, indeed, like you suggest, the wealthy needs to play a role, the state needs to play a role, but in the same time, the individuals within the community, they don't necessarily need to depend on the wealthy or the state to change their circumstances in this regard. I know you must be very exhausted, Dr. Francesca, but perhaps one last question.
Yeah, no, I'm not exhausted at all. Please feel free.
Yes, because early on in your delivery, you mentioned about how mental health, perhaps in the West, tend to be viewed as individualistic and tied to capitalism. Because I sympathize with many friends who work in organizations in the corporate world, because most of the time they don't try to think beyond the challenges within their own organization, but perhaps sometimes it's the organizations or corporations themselves perpetuate a state of working and living that is not conducive at all, because they serve that capitalist agenda to an extreme end. What are your thoughts in terms of how we can move away from that gradually, at least?
Yes. What is quite important is to understand the depth to which contemporary Western psychotherapy and capitalism go hand in hand. And to know this, we have to take the most fierce critics of capitalism, meaning in the Marxist tradition, we find a lot of observation of this. If we take Mark Fisher, he writes this book of Capitalist Realism, which is really interesting. And he says that capitalist realism insists on treating mental health as if it was a biological problem, like a PTSD. And it makes it incumbent on the individual to solve their own psychological distress. Yeah. Also, other authors, I believe Eric Fromm said at a certain point that we are in this new world order of modernity in which the psychologist is its priest. This is very scary, right? Because you go to the psychologist to find the meaning and to find your truth. That's what postmodernity is about, your truth. But if you have your truth and my husband has another truth, then we cannot correlate, we cannot embrace on the level of truth anymore. So we have created the disconnect. So my life is now empty of connection. Where will I fill it in? Well, of course, on Netflix. And it's directly related. You privatize your own experience, and then you have this once a week paid interaction. And of course, I also get paid when I do consultation, but I think it's a problem. I would much be happier if there was a waqf paying me and people didn't have to make this interaction paid from their own money, because it commodifies. This is a big problem mentally. For my mental health, I have to pay. Again, introduce it that. And then what much of Western therapy does is that it empties the person of relationship, which are the last thing which is not monetized. So it's all about boundaries, right? Your mother-in-law says something you don't like, you make a wall. I'm not going to talk to you. No contact, children cutting off parents, parents cutting off children, a mess. And then all that remains is this person living alone, so spending more money, spending more in general, because of course you're unhappy. The only thing that you have left is spending money. And you're just motivated into being able to work. That's also what a lot of psychotherapy does. You have anxiety, you measure anxiety of how much it impacts your work. That's one of the primary factors. Yeah. So the problem is very wide. You cannot just say it's a problem of therapy. It's a problem of worldview. And Western psychotherapy is strongly inserted into the capitalistic worldview. There's no other way to see it.
Indeed, Dr. Francesca, I think there's, as you have repeatedly suggested, there's no shortcut to it. I think our community need to invest. Although, alhamdulillah, Malaysia, perhaps our challenges is less compared to in the West, for example, as you said. But I still feel there's a lot of work to be done, and I think the views that you have shared definitely, inshallah, will inspire and continue to propel perhaps new generations of Muslim intelligentsia, psychologists, as well as leaders who will be much more sensitive and attuned to this aspect of our civilization and living as a Muslim and understanding religion as a deen, not merely as a ritual. I think a lot of this necessitates a whole new level of commitment, or higher level of commitment from Muslims everywhere. We really appreciate your time, Dr. Francesca. Inshallah, we hope to learn and benefit from your insights in the future. Inshallah, perhaps we can host you in Malaysia. We have the opportunity, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Please take
care. I would love inshallah. To.
Yes, please, inshallah, we hope to see you again. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we've been with Dr. Francesca, who's based from Italy, to share her amazing, wonderful insights about the notion of ilmun nafs, or Islamic psychology, and how we should be framing this challenge that we are facing today. With that, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.